Sorry about that. I'm not really 100% sure what happened. I think my video recorder cut out on me. But anyways, let's go ahead and jump right into the lesson, guys. So we're going to jump back into attributes. I know you're getting tired of looking at this same boring web page here. I'm getting tired of looking at it myself, but these are the basics, guys. Let's stay focused. So attributes, we touched a little bit on what are classes, right? We touched on classes, we touched on IDs, but let's actually take a look and see exactly what we mean here. What's going on? What it exactly is an attribute. So an attribute can be given to an element within a tag to allow us to control elements and data within the element more directly and or specifically. We do this by giving an element a customized name or an attribute. And so what that means is that we give an element, which here in the example we can see H1 is our element. We give it that class name so that we can more specifically identify it. It's, for instance, it's the reason why you have a name, why your parents gave you a name, why your name is different from theirs or different from your other siblings. They have to have a way of calling you specifically to get your attention or to complete a specific task, right? If we think about it on a very basic level like that. So in this way, the same thing is happening. We're giving an H1, which we can think of as the person in our example, a class name. So we're giving that person a name. And that way, when we want to identify it and add a style to it in our CSS documents, we can simply call its class name or reference its class name or its ID. And as we learned, an ID is, that's right, it's more specific than a class name. So the ID name we already learned we can give an element. Oops, I'm moving stuff around. We can give an element like the H1 a class or an ID. We could give it both a class and an ID. Now, usually, for the most part, you're going to have one or the other. I don't use IDs too much in my code. And the reason is because later on when you want to change something, you remember how if we think back to the cascading of the style sheets, cascade style sheets, how they move from top to bottom. Well, let's say later on, let's say at the beginning we applied an ID to something, and later on in our document, we don't really remember how to reference it, or we don't remember its name. We don't want to go looking for it. If we want to change it, we'll notice that something is causing it not to change. And usually it's due to the fact that it's being controlled by an ID or something that's referencing it more specifically. So you hear a lot of the times developers will say, I'm debugging. When they're debugging, they're going back and looking for issues within their code that can be corrected to make their code more easy to read, or to make it easier to identify, or to fix an issue that's happening within the code. And sometimes an ID can actually cause you to have an issue like that if you don't remember that you applied an ID to it. So for the most part, you're going to be using classes the majority of the time. Okay, so don't get too used to using IDs. It's really not too necessary, except for maybe when it comes to JavaScript and PHP, really, when you're writing and developing things like online-based forms that people can actually submit, or that are linked to an email address, that kind of thing. So don't use IDs too much. I want you to focus more on using classes. Class names, they're much more versatile. You can change them later on with no issue. And there's some ways around the ID, which I won't get into too much because I don't really use those either, unless I'm editing someone else's code, really. So, that brings us to the definition of classes. And so, as we already have learned, classes allow more specific reference to be given to an element and are placed within the element's tag. They can be observed by, or in a CSS file, by looking for this dot. So we'll see all classes have, in a CSS document, have a dot before their name. So we can see here the class name is class-name. And here we can see, if we assume this is a CSS document, we see dot class-name. So it's written the same way, it just has a dot in the front of it. And then we have our opening and closing curly brackets. Okay. And then as an ID, IDs are more specific than classes. These are attributes where we are definite about. So these are definite, absolute, and I won't say absolute because they can be changed. There's a way around that, but for this example, these are definite. This is a definite attribute. So anything that we were to define in here, such as background color or text color or font size, those would be absolute, and we could not change them without changing specifically the content within that ID, that hashtag ID. Okay, so that kind of limits us on what we can do later. On the flip side, if we use an ID, then we don't have to worry about something changing that we don't want to change later on by targeting something less specifically. For instance, if we had a paragraph with a span inside of it, and the span had an ID of ID name, and we gave that span a specific font size, we maybe later on might edit all the other spans, and we want for that span to remain the same. In that case, an ID is great for that. The variable names, let's go ahead and continue on. The variable names, dot class name, where you're going to start seeing that a lot, dot class name, and hashtag ID name can be changed to anything at your discretion. So those names, of course, as we discussed, can be just about anything. As long as it makes sense, you really don't want a class name that doesn't make sense. Like here in the example, class name makes sense because it helps you to identify what we're talking about. If this was a header, we might call it header. We'll give it a class of header. Or if it was a certain section on our in our HTML document, we might say it was section 1 or section 4 if it was a div. So when it comes to those, yes, you can name it anything, but you want to give it a name that actually makes sense. So, and again, the first letter is usually going to be a lowercase. You can put a capital there, but it's not industry standard, so I would advise against it. Lowercase letters, and then separated by a dash, hyphen, or an underscore. Now, standardly, when you get more into JavaScript, you tend to write class names and ID names like this. That's called camel case. We'll talk more about that later. But standardly, like I said, in HTML, you would write a class like this. It could be one word, it could be 2 words separated with a hyphen, an underscore, or a dash, whatever you want to call it. Okay. It is recommended that they make sense in regards to the content or its positioning within its nesting or position within the file, as we discussed. So that's there for you in your notes. And we've already given some examples here. So let's go back and actually reference our file here. So we can see that we've got a div with a class name of head-section or dash section. Then we've got some other tags in here or elements with some class names. We've got a main header, which makes sense because this is really the main H1 in the first section of our browser. That's the first thing people would see. Maybe we would give this section, and here I'll do it long for you guys. Div class equals, and again we can use double quotations or singles. Let's keep them the same. And we'll say section 1. Okay. Go ahead and, so I'm using a laptop here. All right. Close it down here so it encapsulates all our data. Let's not forget our indentations. There's faster ways of doing that. You can actually, I don't know what it is on a Mac, but on a Windows computer, I think it's control space. What is it? Control tab? Oop, that just changes tabs. Okay, just forget what I said. So yeah, let's go ahead and add our indentation here. Okay, oh, that's wrong. And then we'll notice, guys, just a little tip for you. If I wanted to know where this tag was closed, where it was closed without having to, just to give me a visual aid to help me recognize when this tag is closing, I can actually look for this little line here. So hopefully you guys can see that. There's a little line underneath this div, and that's just letting me know when I click here that this is the closing div. Just like when I click here, I can see that little line there. So hopefully you have high enough definition to where you can see this. But if you can't, there's a little gray line underneath this div here. That's letting me know that that's where this one is closing. But anyways, we might give this div a class name of section 1 and then indent everything underneath it. And that way we can see that these are the children of that new div we just created. We might even give it some white space so we can see a clear break between our divs. That helps us to recognize what's going on. And that looks nice and clean. Okay. And we might give this header, we could even make this a header 2 or subheader or something like that. And you'll see the font size decrease. Okay, so H2. Now let's get a little bit more in depth with our attributes here. So this is a very frequently used attribute, or excuse me, tag. It's called the anchor tag. It's this little A here, okay? And an anchor usually looks something like this. Now this is an example of a anchor that's going to take somebody back to the home page. So this is basically a link. And let's go ahead and look at the definition. The anchor creates a link to another page and or file location. In the above example we've created, let's go ahead and take a look here. So we create an opening tag with an element. So the anchor element. Okay, we can see here that we've created that anchor. And then we've referenced a file location. So the file location that we were actually referencing is another HTML file, which would be called index.html. Okay, and then we've assigned it a class name so that we can specifically reference that anchor. Okay. And then we added some visible text for the link and closed the anchor tag. So this here in blue, this is the physical text that we would see. When we click that, normally it has an underline on it in a browser, and I'll show you. So let's go ahead and add just one link down here outside of our divs. So to be out here alone, no container, no nothing, just an anchor. So we said ahref equals, and then we'll say google.com. Actually, let's say W3 schools. So we'll say w3schools.com. Okay. And then we'll call that W3 schools. We'll see it show up, and here it is with its blue underline. That's standard. That's going to happen every time you create a link. Okay. So this is basically what's happening. We're creating a quick link to that website location. So if we open link in a new tab, Codepen throws an error, but normally it would. Here, let's do this. Say W3 schools. Let's click it. So we can actually go ahead and go here and just copy the URL, go back to Codepen, and change our href to https www.w3schools.com. And then let's see if it works. Okay, so Codepen's going to keep throwing us that error, but if we were in another code editor, it would take us directly to that page. Let's try google.com. Go ahead and save it. Yeah, for some reason, Codepen keeps throwing that error, but normally it would just take you to the page. So disregard that. Once again, this is one of the downsides to using a sandbox environment. Sometimes you have little errors like that, like a redirect or something isn't working. Let's see if we just click it. Yeah, that's why. So the redirect isn't working. But if you're using an actual code editor, that's not a sandbox environment like this, you won't have that problem. It'll just take you straight to the page. Okay. Or maybe let's get rid of this slash. Nope, same thing. Okay, yeah. So normally if you're linking it to a file, you want that slash in there. Okay. So this is an anchor tag. And again, all the anchor is doing is creating a link. If you're like me, you're probably wondering how to get rid of that ugly underscore. And you can just go in here and say style. Text decoration. None. We can get rid of that. And we could even change the color to black. This is another style of another way to write styles into our page. We'll actually talk about that later on. But for now, let's go ahead and leave that as just a regular link. Okay. Now we did talk briefly about the link. I'm not going to give too many examples of this. There's tons of information out there for linking to another page, but essentially if you're linking a CSS file to an HTML document, the reason you're doing that is because obviously you want for your styles to show up, but they're always going to look the same. The only thing that's really going to change is the name of the file you're referencing. So here we can see that we're creating a link to a style sheet. Of course, we know that's a CSS document. We're saying the type is text/CSS. You don't really need to write the type in there. In fact, most of the time I don't. But you can if you want. So preference thing there. Otherwise, you need the href or where it's linking to, what the file location is. Kind of like that anchor, we're linking an href, which is the attribute. Same thing's happening here. We're linking an href to a file location. And this, of course, is going to be the file of which our CSS document is stored in. Okay. In this case, we've got a styles folder, and then we've got the main.css document. And so they'll look like that every time. There's other types of links, but they're mainly geared towards linking fonts. So I guess I can show you guys that real quick. So fonts, usually what I do is I'll go to like Google Fonts, which you can see here. I've got it stored. I use it every day. I would pick my favorite font, so you can go down the list, blah, blah, blah. I like Quicksand. I'd hit the plus. I'd open this up. I would just copy this link, put it into my head, because remember, that's where our links go. And boom, I've just installed the Quicksand font into my document, so now I can use it. I could actually go in here and say body font style and say Quicksand. Or is it font family? It's font family. And you notice that my font changes. Now normally if you're doing a font change, you're going to add a secondary one in case the browser doesn't have access to that one. So we would just say sans serif. So we can pick. If Quicksand's not there, it'll just go with sans serif. So that's the other thing, guys, is linking in a font family. Okay. And last for this lesson, guys, we're going to cover images. Now, I will say this is a way to put an image into a document. It absolutely is a way. And you can do it this way. Later on, I'm going to show you guys how to do it with CSS, which is generally the way that web developers put images into their documents. But this is available for you as a beginner to be able to pop an image real quick into your HTML document, especially if it's something really super simple and quick. So for a quick image, we'll begin with the image tag. And it's IMG. That's the tag, the IMG. It's a self-closing tag, so we'll notice that it has this / right before it ends. That's how we know it's a self-closing tag, kind of like our link. Self-closing. Okay. So an image or IMG can be written as a self-closing tag. Okay. You can also write it the other way, and it'll work. I'm not really sure why it works, because technically this is the way you're supposed to write it, but you can also write it like this. Maybe you want to put some text inside of the image or put a button inside of it or something like that. You could write it this way, but this is generally the way you're going to include that image. So all we're doing here is we're saying image, we're using the image element to say that we're putting an image in. Then we're saying source. So instead of href with an image, we're using the source attribute. So source works in the same exact way as the href, in that we're literally just plugging in a file location. So here we're saying image, the source of the image, and then alt. Again, you don't really need the alt. That's why it's yellow. It's optional. But the alt is giving it a name. So if I were to hit Control F on my browser and try and locate a specific image based on its name, that's really what it's useful for. But otherwise, you can actually exclude the alt. It's not really necessary. Okay. So I'm going to leave the rest. Actually, let's go ahead and read through here as we get into some more styles. So this tag is really special. because it allows you to place an image directly into an HTML document. But you can also add a height and a width so you can modify the sizes directly. So that can be useful in that we can basically plug an image in, tell us where the image is stored, and then directly within that same line of code, we can say the height, we want the height to be 100 pixels and the width to be 100 pixels. And here we can see we're using the height as an attribute and we're using width as an attribute. We could come in here and say style equals, and then say height, and we would basically be, if we did it that way, we would basically be accessing the CSS styles. But this is really the way you want to do it if you're using the img image tag within an HTML file. And so that's what this explains, is that you can also do it within the CSS document. And so let's show you how that looks. So before, actually let's expand this, save it. And so we're going to plug in an image right before this link. And we're just going to say image. And look, oh, we hit img tab and we get all the information, all the attributes in here we already need. So let's say, let's just call it image in the alt, since we're apparently including that. And let's find an image. So inside of Codepen, you can use images by going down to where it says assets, clicking that assets button. And then you can actually scroll down here and you can pick an image. I did some ads for High Times, don't judge me. And those were actually real ads for the Alaska Cannabis Cup of 2018. Yeah. That's where I'm at, by the way, for you guys out there. I live in the beautiful snowy desert of Alaska. And let's find, oh, that is not pretty. Let's just find snowy mountains. Here we go. That's a cool image. So we'll copy background. We'll hit that little drop down arrow, hit copy as background, or you can even copy it as an image tag. So here they're giving us the option. Let's do that. Let's copy it as an image tag. Let's actually delete this and just boom, go ahead and plug that in. And then see, it's got our alt here. We can say mountains and just call it mountains. So if we were to hit Control F, our search bar pops up. We can say mountains, enter, and boom, it highlights mountains for us. So that's really the use of the alt, in case you're wondering. But boom, there it is. We've got a picture, and then directly below, we've got a link. Pretty cool, huh? Here, let's expand that. And you'll notice that it's actually putting the image in line with the text. So that's something that you actually have to work around when you put an image in this way. But as we've learned, we could just say line break. And boom, it's underneath it. Nice and clean. Doesn't matter how wide the viewport is. Okay? So we can do that. We've already got our source plugged in because that's what Codepen does for us. And then we just gave it a name, mountains. Now, if we wanted to size it ourselves, we could say height equals 100 pixels. And then we could say width equals 120 pixels. Ooh. Okay, and that's pretty much how we size our image. Let's say 300. And let's say 300. Okay. So the weird thing about putting an image in like this is that it can actually stretch your image. So if I wanted to say 620, it's just stretching my image. It could even stretch my image all the way across to 100% of the page. But it's stretching. So that's one example again of why developers usually will not put images into a web browser in this way, but it is an option. So now you know. All right, guys. So that about wraps it up for our tutorial today. We've covered lots of juicy material. You guys can check out some of the links below of some reference material for you to look at. And always take a little bit of time to look through some other tags and other things that you maybe haven't seen before or that we haven't talked about in this tutorial, because there are just that many. There's literally no way. I mean, there's obviously I could sit here for 2 or 3 hours and cover every single tag, but there's always more um, information out there for you to reference. So I'm gonna leave a few links in the description for you guys. If you have questions or that kind of thing, I really try and answer them as quickly as possible. So just bear with me. And thank you so much for supporting my channel. I really appreciate it. I love doing this, guys. For those of you who didn't watch my bio video, this is something that I absolutely love to do. I've worked in many different industries before, and until I discovered code, I really didn't have a direction for where I wanted to, how I wanted to make a business of my own. And this has really been the major thing that has got me here doing these tutorials. It's just my passion for writing code and my passion for design. And I hope that translates in these tutorials. I hope they really help you to get to where you want to be, to get that dream job of being the nerd at a desk, right, with his nose in his computer screen and just writing code all day. Whether you're a hacker, a web developer, front or back end, I really hope that these tutorials help you guys. So thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much for the folks out there who like and subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate it. Seriously, words can't express. So these videos are just a way for me to spread the love, spread the knowledge, and hopefully one day you'll be sitting at home making your own tutorials. So cheers to that. I'll see you guys on the next Web Tips tutorials.